Black boy, get out of here! Professor Daniel Almeida yelled at the young black student who had ventured into his class. This is advanced calculus, not simple arithmetic. The remarks echoed throughout the esteemed classroom. What followed, though, left everyone in utter quiet. Most people would anticipate confusion, possibly even tears, when a 12-year-old boy shows up for a calculus class at a university. However, Gabriel Santos did not meet the majority's criteria. Furthermore, nobody could have foreseen what would transpire over the next 8 minutes when a conceited instructor chose to humiliate him by posing an intractable problem that even doctorate students couldn't answer. Tell us where you are watching from before we head back. Make sure to subscribe if this tale resonates with you, because I have something very unique planned for you tomorrow. The task was put out by Professor Daniel Almeida, who was certain that the 12-year-old child, Gabriel, would not be able to complete it, expecting someone to chuckle at the boy's foolishness. He glanced at the other pupils, but Gabriel didn't think twice. With firmness and clarity, he declared, "I accept the challenge." The kids exchanged dubious looks as the room grew tense, uncomfortable with the young man's audacity. The teacher attempted to conceal his uneasiness with a fake grin. He was uncomfortable at the thought of being challenged by a student of that age. But he was adamant about keeping his power. The fight was about to start. The instructor then started writing a challenging problem on the board that he thought a kid Gabriel's age couldn't possibly answer. He couldn't help but smirk smugly as he wrote. Gabriel observed carefully, deciphering every term and symbol. Gabriel's resolve was only strengthened by the teacher's emphasis on the problem's difficulty. He understood the challenge as a chance to demonstrate that mathematics transcends age and discrimination. But the room seemed to be waiting for him to fail. Gabriel was more than just a youngster. He represented triumphing over impending hardship. The other pupils, who had been doubtful at first, started to look at each other with interest. Some, like Lucas Martins, were giggling silently because they believed Gabriel couldn't possibly figure out the solution. Others, such as Carla Souza, observed in astonishment and curiosity. As time went on, the anxiety in the room increased. But Gabriel stayed composed, his mind functioning like a calculator. The focus shifted from solving a problem to demonstrating something much more significant, that true knowledge was indispensable in the face of age or appearance-based constraints. The teacher, who was now clearly uneasy, made an effort to remain calm. But Gabriel presented a challenge. Everyone in the room stared at the boy's solid, perfect handwriting as he started writing on the board. Gabriel's arrival was so unexpected that the teacher had to swallow hard. He made a vain attempt to conceal the pain on his face. There must be something wrong, he whispered to himself. The teacher realized that he was going to lose control of the classroom because of Gabriel's confidence. The truth was about to be revealed. Professor Daniel Almeida smiled sarcastically as he issued the challenge. He had just scribbled a problem on the board, and for a moment he didn't think 12-year-old Gabriel could figure it out. Advanced mathematics, he was sure, demanded more than any child could provide. "You can stay if you can finish this in 30 minutes, he replied patronizingly. The teacher was astonished by Gabriel's unwavering voice as he responded, "I accept," with remarkable composure for someone so young. Then, Teacher Almeida started out by outlining the issue. It was a difficult formula, a test designed specifically to make Gabriel look foolish. He was aware that the boy would fail even if he made an effort. All of the students were watching carefully to see what would happen next when the room fell silent. Gabriel, though, was unconcerned. He had never been more concentrated. He examined the symbols on the board, identifying hidden structures and patterns with each explanation from the instructor. He understood that this challenge was a chance to demonstrate something more than just his skill level. The pupils were split apart. One of the most well-liked, Lucas Martins, chuckled quietly, finding the boy's boldness amusing. Carla Souza looked on, fascinated. The other students in the class were just as doubtful and were waiting for Gabriel to fail. However, when they noticed Gabriel's unfazed look, things started to shift. Everyone was waiting for the boys' next move as the tension increased and the room fell hushed. Where there had been quiet laughter before, Gabriel started writing on the board with remarkable concentration. He moved with speed and accuracy. Professor Almeida came forward, attempting to conceal his discomfort. The crowd stared in disbelief as the young man not only solved the problem, but also dismantled the equation with a clarity that left the professor stunned. "That's not right," he whispered. But Gabriel calmly responded, "I'm just getting started." Professor Almeida saw Gabriel's rapid motions and accurate handwriting as he worked through the equation. There was an internal conflict going on in his heart. How could a youngster challenge him? He struggled with feelings of humiliation and pride. He made an effort to persuade himself that the issue was simply too difficult for such a young learner to handle. However, he felt uneasy about something in Gabriel's eyes. How could someone so young exhibit such control? He wondered. The teacher's independence started to deteriorate. Gabriel, on the other hand, was fully engaged in the task. He was revealing the mathematical structure that the teacher was attempting to conceal behind intricate formulas, not merely solving a problem. When he looked at the equation, he saw the hidden symmetry that the teacher had missed. He applied complex ideas flawlessly, and his intellect navigated them with ease. For everyone else in the room, it felt like an insurmountable challenge, but it became a normal part of his problem-solving process. Tension grew in the classroom environment. The class silently followed Gabriel's every action, their gazes riveted on him. Carla Souza was one of the students who started to question whether they were simply following the crowd or truly knew advanced arithmetic. It seemed unbelievable that a 12-year-old youngster could have mastered such a difficult subject. The issue itself was no longer the only source of stress in the room. It was also about redefining what it meant to be a specialist in a certain profession. The other pupils, some of whom were totally lost, were paralyzed while Gabriel worked rapidly and meticulously. Lucas Martins, who had always seen himself as one of the greatest, felt his confidence being called into question as he glanced at his screen. Searching for a way out, the argument became personal rather than merely scholarly. The entire class was discovering that great skill and understanding knew no age boundaries. And Gabriel was more than just a pupil. Professor Daniel Almeida grew agitated as Gabriel wrote on the board. Something stopped him from interrupting and pointing out flaws. He was no longer able to criticize the boy's logic, but when he mentally went over the board, he was troubled by what he had done incorrectly. He was well aware of the small error he had made in applying the chain rule during one of his earlier explanations. However, he was unable to admit this error because of his authoritarian attitude, trying to conceal his uneasiness. He continued. Gabriel's intense gaze caught the error almost immediately, calmly, not impatiently, but convinced that it needed to be fixed. He raised his hand. In line 3, "Professor, you misused the chain rule. The final solution and the partial derivative are impacted by this," Gabriel stated in a clear and authoritative voice. As the students realized that the young guy was calling attention to an error made by one of the department's most esteemed professors, the entire classroom became silent. However, the instructor took some time to acknowledge the error. His face was a mixture of fury and mistrust as he gazed at Gabriel, seeking to recover his position of authority. He responded, "I've been teaching calculus for over 30 years. Are you certain you are more knowledgeable in calculus than I am?" The challenge was in the air, and Almeida's opposition appeared to be becoming more and more baseless. Gabriel, however, refused to be intimidated and stayed steadfast. Once disinterested, the students were now fully involved. Some started to question whether the instructor was mistaken. As Gabriel and the teacher's altercation grew more obvious, the tension in the room rose. While Lucas Martins was unsure of what to believe, Carla Souza watched closely. A 12-year-old youngster was tearing apart respect for the teacher's authority. And the class, which had previously thought the situation humorous, was now enmeshed in a profound epiphany. Gabriel's correction annoyed teacher Daniel Almeida, who attempted to reverse the situation to his advantage. Grinning tensely, he walked over to the board and suggested, "Since you seem to know so much, let's see if you can solve something more challenging. Let's check to see if you can continue at this level." The teacher sketched an even more complicated equation that would theoretically take years of study to understand in an apparent attempt to regain his authority. "You can remain in class if you can finish this in 30 minutes. If not, you'll have to go." Gabriel accepted the challenge without hesitation. He took a step back from the board and cast a calculating glance at the calculation. All of the kids were silently observing the altercation in the tense classroom. Gabriel's confidence pleased Carla Souza. Lucas Martins, however, questioned how a young person could take on such a bold task. Once distrustful, the remainder of the class now felt a part of the drama playing out in front of them, with a tone of superiority. Professor Almeida started out by thoroughly outlining the issue, in an attempt to scare Gabriel with the intricacy. He used words that undergraduate students couldn't understand. Gabriel, though, was not deterred. He was aware that he would have to adopt a precise technique and concentrate on all facets of the equation in order to tackle this challenge. He was already starting to consider his approach to the answer as the lecturer was speaking, while concealing his uneasiness. The professor was committed to setting up Gabriel's failure. He felt that shame was unavoidable and that this difficulty was especially challenging. Despite his mounting uneasiness, he tried to seem unconcerned, thinking, "It's not every day we have a math genius around here." The professor was unaware, however, that Gabriel was about to entirely reverse the situation with his unique talent. Professor Almeida took a step back from the board and gave Gabriel a phony smile. He was aware that, if he could solve the equation, it would take him hours, because it was a real mathematical labyrinth. He characterized the issue as a sophisticated form of the well-known and challenging Navier-Stokes equation. He was certain that no one, especially Gabriel, would even begin to comprehend it. This is something that even doctoral students have trouble with. "Kid, let's see how you do," with variables and terms that made the answer all but unattainable. The equation appeared to be a monstrosity. Almeida thought he was in control of the situation. He came up with a solution to the problem that no one, not even PhD students, could come up with in a short amount of time. In addition to humiliating Gabriel, he was sure that this would demonstrate to the class that his power was unassailable. It appeared that he was looking forward to the point at which Gabriel would give up and concede defeat. The professor was unaware, though, that by erecting this barrier, he was merely allowing Gabriel to express his unrealized potential. Now the pupils were paying full attention. Many were waiting to see how Gabriel would respond to such a difficult situation. While some were concerned and others were skeptical, Lucas Martins, who had previously questioned Gabriel's skills, watched with increasing skepticism, while the rest of the class sat in suspense, unsure of what to anticipate from the youthful visitor. Carla Souza felt a mixture of respect and interest, although the outcome was hard to foretell. Everyone sensed that something spectacular was going to occur. With everyone's attention on Gabriel, the entire room appeared to be frozen in time. His eyes was fixed intently on the board, analyzing the terms. He appeared to be figuring out the best strategy for solving the problem. Even yet his fingers were poised to grab the chalk and begin writing. In addition to the equation's complexity, the tension increased as it became apparent that the professor and young prodigy's dispute was about to intensify. The air was heavy with anticipation. Gabriel's concentration was great as he gazed at the board. The equation initially appeared to be a mathematical monster, with intricately entwined terms and variables that were challenging to understand. Gabriel, however, was unfazed. He mentally divided the terms and arranged the variables in a way that made sense to him. He was uncovering hidden patterns and linkages rather than merely completing an equation. Math was a conundrum that Gabriel knew he could solve. Gabriel started using variable transformations as the rest of the class silently observed. He was certain that Professor Almeida had overlooked symmetries hidden in the problem. The only sound in the room was the scratching of chalk on the board. With remarkable ease, Gabriel arranged terms and drew lines. The others couldn't believe how he was breaking down the equation. But for him, like so many other problems he had already encountered, it was just another stage in the solution process. Tell us where you are watching from before we head back. Make sure to subscribe if this tale resonates with you, because I have something very unique planned for you tomorrow. Gabriel maintained total composure as the pressure increased with time. He didn't appear to be aware of the gravity of the circumstance or the kid's attentive gaze. He moved without hesitancy, with speed and accuracy. His attention was solely on his task, as though there were no other considerations. This was a combination of technical proficiency and a serene assurance that he was headed in the right direction, now completely struck by the boy's focus and grace. The class watched. When he came to a critical section of the equation, Gabriel took a moment to consider the outcomes he had achieved. Yes, the equation was rather complicated, but he had figured it out. He was aware that he was not only resolving the issue, but also casting doubt on the notion that a person of his age could not solve this kind of equation. As he went on, Gabriel showed that knowledge and ability had no boundaries, independent of age or perceived limitations. Professor Almeida peered suspiciously at Gabriel. He was starting to doubt his own authority, even though he didn't want to acknowledge it. How could this 12-year-old boy solve the equation with the talent that he, after decades of experience, believed was unattainable for a child his age? The professor became more and more confused with every step Gabriel took, though he couldn't bring himself to acknowledge it in front of the class. He started to question whether he had been too quick to underestimate the young guy. He forced himself to keep up his attitude of supremacy even as his internal resistance to Gabriel's talent increased. Do you think you're capable of understanding what you're really doing? This isn't as simple as the equations you solve at home. Kid, it sounded harsher than he meant to, but he couldn't hide his discomfort at seeing such a young student dealing with an equation that seemed beyond his comprehension. Almeida looked at Gabriel in an attempt to regain his confidence. Nevertheless, Gabriel refused to be swayed. He was aware that he was headed in the correct direction, and the professor's response just served to reinforce the fact that he was going against the grain. The teaching assistant, Sarah Martinez, was observing intently. This was unlike any of the instructional scenarios she had seen. She couldn't help but be amazed by what Gabriel was accomplishing on the board. She was aware that Gabriel's solution was more than just sophisticated arithmetic. It was an example of a prodigy at work, something uncommon. Eager to see how far Gabriel could push the answer, Sarah leaned forward. The room was growing more tense. In addition to finding a solution, Gabriel was unequivocally proving that knowledge was not limited by one's age or appearance. Uncomfortable, Professor Almeida struggled to maintain his power. However, he was aware that he was losing control of the room and possibly his own conviction with each new symbol Gabriel scribbled on the board. Despite Professor Almeida's provocations, Gabriel maintained his composure. Gabriel merely grinned a little when the professor implied that he didn't know what he was doing. He answered calmly and firmly, "I understand perfectly." With everyone's attention on Gabriel, the room became quiet. His answer was a subtle proclamation that he was more than ready for this challenge. In addition to confirming his knowledge, he kept writing on the board with such assurance that the teacher started to feel even more uneasy. Despite his best efforts, Professor Almeida was aware that he was losing control of the situation. Every mathematical move Gabriel made on the board demonstrated a level of proficiency he did not anticipate, much less from a youngster so young. In an attempt to minimize Gabriel's efforts, The professor remarked. "You're fortunate. Maybe you read something on the internet or watched a video. It's not possible that someone so young could have done this on their own." However, Gabriel was actually tackling the problem with a depth that was unusual. So Almeida's statement seemed hollow. There was no sound in the room, as the students gazed in awe. The sound of chalk drawing on the board reverberated. Carla Souza, who had questioned Gabriel's skills at first, was now baffled by the depth of logic he was using in the face of Gabriel's lucidity. Lucas Martins, who had always believed in his own intelligence, started to doubt it. Both Gabriel and the pupils, who were starting to recognize the boy's talent, were under increasing strain. There was an electrical charge in the classroom, despite Professor Almeida's best efforts to remain authoritative. Gabriel's eyes were becoming more and more sparkling. It became increasingly clear, with each mathematical symbol he put on the board, that he was questioning not just the professor's expertise, but also everyone else's expectations. The professor realized he was losing the power game, which was becoming a contest of cunning. The strained focus that pervaded the room was abruptly broken when the classroom door opened. The head of the mathematics department, Dr. Beatriz Lima, came in. She was a petite woman who immediately attracted everyone's attention with her commanding presence. She did not want to waste time. As seen by her sharp gaze and thin-rimmed glasses, she continued, her gaze swiftly scanning the scene in front of the board. "I hear there's something interesting going on here." Teaching assistant Sarah Martinez got up right away, took her tablet, and went over to Dr. Beatriz. "What's happening here?" Dr. Lima is, well, something unusual. Professor Almeida is obviously uncomfortable when Mr. Gabriel Santos, a student in the enrichment program, solved an incredibly difficult problem in a surprising way. Dr. Beatriz first remained silent and simply gazed at Gabriel with a face that combined surprise and fascination, trying to keep his cool and have a serious expression on his face. Professor Almeida turned to face Dr. Beatriz and stated defensively, "Doctor, this is a singular incident." Lima, the youngster might have viewed a movie or read something. Dr. Beatriz, however, did not appear impressed by his attempt to explain the error. She gestured for him to stay silent with a casual wave of her hand after turning back to the board. "I looked at Gabriel's artwork. It's neither a trick nor chance. He is incredibly talented." The students were in disbelief, with her eyes wide. Carla Souza remained sat and observed everything. Lucas Martins was a little stunned by what was happening and found it hard to believe. Everyone became silent when Dr. Beatriz Lima, a recognized academic expert in the topic, arrived. What had begun as a straightforward argument between instructor and pupil had now evolved into a show of respect and appreciation for Gabriel's brilliance. The tenseness in the room did not go away. Rather, it was going to get worse. Leaning forward, Sarah Martinez stared at the calculations that Gabriel was writing on the board. Since the boy had come into the room, she had been keeping track of his development. But what she witnessed now was astounding. She was aware that Professor Almeida's suggested problem was infamously challenging, something that even doctorate students typically struggle to complete. Gabriel's answer, on the other hand, was exact, with every step being well explained. Sarah grabbed her iPad and started comparing the figures she was holding with Gabriel's work. No error occurred. He was correct. Sarah was so impressed that she got up and went to the board to examine Gabriel's work in greater detail. "He's right. What Gabriel has done here is not only correct, it's extraordinary. This is a level of reasoning that I've only seen in some of the best mathematicians," she said confidently, turning to face Professor Almeida and the class. Her eyes glistened as she gazed at Gabriel, saying, "You have an incredible talent." With a slight smile, the admiration in her voice was too strong for the kids to ignore. It was now obvious that Professor Almeida, who had up until that point attempted to preserve his authority, was uneasy. Sarah's words weighed heavily on him, and he began to feel the mounting pressure of dealing with a skill he had not expected. He made an effort to remain calm, but something inside of him was shifting. He was aware that he could no longer ignore what was taking place. In addition to questioning his preconceptions, Gabriel was also questioning the notion that age or experience placed restrictions on mathematical ability. Once doubtful, the kids were now utterly quiet. They sensed a sense of surprise and reverence when the atmosphere changed. Lucas Martins, who had before made fun of the notion of a 12-year-old youngster handling such challenges, was now stunned, wide-eyed. Carla Souza tried to process the enormity of what was unfolding. The classroom was now utterly engrossed in a hushed respect for Gabriel and his indisputable genius. Where there had previously been laughing and discussion, with a face that conveyed both surprise and a certain curiosity, Dr. Beatriz Lima gazed at the board. She was aware of how challenging Almeida's dilemma was, and Gabriel's solution went above and above. That's impressive. Gabriel, what you've done here is not just mathematical problem solving. This is innovation. She stepped forward and said calmly, "You were too quick to judge the potential of our visitor." Dr. Beatriz's authority was evident, and her gaze remained fixed on Professor Almeida, who was visibly uncomfortable, now intently observing. Sarah Martinez couldn't agree with Dr. Beatriz more. She walked over to the board and indicated Gabriel's figures. "Professor, this isn't just a straightforward application of theory. This is a step up. He has made connections between a number of mathematical disciplines with a clarity that the majority of our doctorate students still lack." All of the pupils were now fully engrossed in the scenario, and the room was quiet. Gabriel's genius was no longer in doubt. Even by the most doubtful, there was a quiet respect for the intelligence on exhibit in the air. For his part, Professor Almeida was clearly uneasy. He made an effort to keep his commanding stance, but he knew the truth was obvious to everyone in the room. He tried to sound steady as he muttered, "That's just luck." However, his tone was really an effort to shield his pride. He didn't want to think that a young student like that could figure out a problem that he, with all his knowledge, couldn't solve. Everyone in the class was listening to what was going on in respectful silence. Lucas Martins, who had been doubtful, suddenly appeared to realize the enormity of the situation. With wide eyes, Carla Souza recognized that she was seeing something remarkable, and with her commanding stance, Dr. Beatriz Lima was aware that something essential was happening right then. A lesson in humility and the appreciation of unadulterated talent resulted from what had begun as an attempt to degrade a pupil. Now Professor Almeida felt quite uneasy. He made an effort to remain calm, but Gabriel's skill was overshadowing his authority. He shifted uneasily and feigned a smile while stroking his hair. That doesn't change anything. It's just a matter of luck. The problem isn't that difficult," he said, but his confidence had diminished. In reality, he was starting to realize that, as Gabriel had shown, mathematics didn't care about titles or age. Since you think you're capable of solving this kind of problem, Gabriel, I'll give you a real challenge. Let's see if you can really solve a complete Navier-Stokes equation. Almeida took a deep breath, attempting to gather his thoughts. He was aware that Dr. Beatriz Lima walked up to the board and turned to face Gabriel with a resolute and forceful expression. She was aware that his actions were an unquestionable display of genius. "I don't believe there is anything more to say here. Professor Almeida, Gabriel has demonstrated more than just talent. This is the future of mathematics, and there's no way to ignore what we have just witnessed," she said, gesturing around the room. "He has just shown us extraordinary talent." A respectful quiet now enveloped the students. What had appeared to be a disagreement between a haughty instructor and a gifted pupil had now evolved into a tacit acknowledgement of Gabriel's brilliance. Even Professor Almeida, attempting to maintain his composure, knew that he could no longer deny what had just transpired. The pupils would never forget that day when mathematics broke through all age and expectation barriers. And the room had altered. If this story resonated with you, tell someone who needs motivation to stand up for what's right. Remember that empathy and respect have the capacity to change lives. And sign up for more transformational stories. Remember to never undervalue anyone based solely on their outward appearance.